The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, the third day. As soon as the lovely day had broken, and the blessed sun had risen over the mountains, and begun its appointed task in the high heavens, my good cohorts began to get out of bed and prepare themselves leisurely for the Inquisition. One after another came back into the hall, wished us good day, and inquired how we had slept. When they saw our bonds, many of them reproached us for having been so despondent, and not, like them, unhesitatingly trusted to our luck. There were, however, a few who did not crow so loud, because their hearts were already thumping. We excused ourselves on the grounds of our lack of sense, and hoped that we would get away the quicker, unharmed. We bore their mockery with the knowledge that, far from being through with the affair, they perhaps had the worst still to come. When at length everyone was assembled again, a flourish on the trumpets and drums announced what we could only take to be the imminent arrival of the bridegroom. But there we were wrong, for it was again the same virgin as yesterday. She was dressed all in red velvet and girdled with a white ribbon. On her head she wore a fresh green laurel wreath, which suited her splendidly. Her train no longer consisted of little lights, but of nigh on 200 armed men, all uniformed like her in red and white. As soon as she had leapt from her seat, the Virgin came up to us prisoners, and after greeting us said shortly, "That some of you are aware of your wretchedness pleases greatly my severe Lord, and he wishes you to be recompensed." And when she saw me in my habit, she laughed and said, "Are you also under the yoke? I would have thought that you were too finely turned out." With those words my eyes overflowed. Then she gave orders for us to be untied and coupled together, and had us placed so that we could get a good view of the scales. Then she said, "It may go better for you than for these daredevils who are still free." Meanwhile the scales, gilded all over, were hung up in the middle of the hall. Then a little table was covered with red velvet, and 7 weights were laid on it. First there was quite a large one, then 4 small ones, and lastly 2 more large ones. These weights were so heavy in proportion to the size that no one could believe or even imagine it. Each of the men-at-arms had, besides an unsheathed sword, a strong rope. They were grouped in 7 bands, corresponding to the number of weights, and in each band 1 man was assigned to its weight. Then the Virgin leapt back onto her high throne, and as soon as she had made her reverence, she began to speak with a loud voice. "Whoever enters the painter's shop and knows not how to paint and chats of it affectedly is a laughing stock to all. Whoever joins a craftsman's guild and has not been elected and plies the craft affectedly is a laughing stock to all. Whoever hastens to a wedding when no one asked him there, yet enters in affectedly, is a laughing stock to all. If you should climb upon the scale and find your way too light, so that you fly up with a crack, you're a laughing stock to all." No sooner had the Virgin spoken, and she told one of the pages to arrange everyone according to rank and have them mount the scales one after another. One of the emperors did not hesitate, but bowed slightly to the Virgin and then climbed up, all in his state apparel. Each captain laid his weight on, but to everyone's surprise, the scale remained unmoved. However, the last weight was too heavy for him, and up he rose with such disappointment that even the Virgin was sorry for him, it seemed to me. She signalled her people to hold their peace, but the good emperor was bound and delivered to the 6th band. After him came a second emperor, climbing proudly onto the scale. For since he had a great thick book under his robe, he thought that he could not fail. Scarcely was the third weight on, that he was shot up into the air so unmercifully that in his terror he let the book fall. This set all the soldiers laughing, and the emperor was handed over, bound to the 3rd band. So it went with quite a few emperors, who were all shamefully laughed at and put in captivity. Next came a short little fellow, also an emperor, with a curly brown beard. After the customary bow, he placed himself on the scale and stood so bravely through the weights that I thought he could even have held out for more if there had been any. The Virgin quickly arose and went up to him, bowed and invested him with a red velvet jacket. Then she handed to him one of the many laurel wreaths that lay on her seat and bade him sit down on the steps below her throne. It would take too long to tell how it went after this with all the other emperors, kings and lords, but I cannot omit the fact that very few such noble persons were left, although many of them, contrary to my expectation, showed considerable virtues. One could withstand this weight, another that, some 2, 3, 4, or even 5, but few were able to attain final perfection. As each one proved too light, the bands of soldiers laughed heartily at him. The testing proceeded with the noble men, the learned men, and others, and in each class, sometimes 1, sometimes 2, but more often not a single one was found adequate. Then came the turn of those pious gentlemen, the swindlers, and the toadies who manufacture the universal cure-all. These were put on the scale to such derision that even I, for all my sorrow, almost burst myself laughing, and the prisoners themselves could not suppress their mirth. For most of them could not even wait for the solemn sentence. They were chased from the scales with rods and scourges, and led off to join the other prisoners, but each in an appropriate band. So few of the great crowd remained that I would be embarrassed to tell their number, but there were important personages among them, although everyone was honoured alike with velvet clothing and a laurel wreath. When at last the trial was over, and no one remained standing off to the side, but we poor coupled hounds, one of the captains came up and spoke. "Gracious lady, if it please your grace, we would like to allow these poor people, who have acknowledged their inadequacy, to climb on the scale too, but without any danger to them, and only in good humour. There may be some worth among them." At first I was greatly afraid, but in my distress was comforted by the thought that, in this way, I would not have to be held up to derision or whipped out of the scale. I had no doubt that many of the prisoners wished they had spent 10 nights with us in the hall, but since the Virgin consented, it had to be done, and so we were untied and one after the other placed on the scale. Although most failed, they were neither mocked nor beaten, but gently ushered to the side. My companion was the 5th. He held out bravely, gratifying many people, especially the captain, who put in a word for us, and the Virgin bestowed on him the customary honour. After him, 2 more were flipped up in the air. I was the 8th. As soon as I stepped up trembling, my companion looked at me encouragingly, sitting there already in his velvet, and even the Virgin smiled a little. But when I endured through all the weights, she tried to have me tugged up by main force. Yet although 3 men hung on the other side of the scales, they could do nothing. Straightway, one of the pages stood up and cried out as loud as he could, "It is he!" Whereupon the other answered, "Then let him have his freedom." And this the Virgin granted. After I had been inducted with the usual ceremony, I was given the chance of releasing a prisoner of my choice. I did not hesitate for long, but chose the first emperor who had pitied me from the beginning. He was immediately set free and seated among us with all honour. Now, when the last person had been weighed, but the weights proved too heavy for him, the Virgin spied the roses which I had taken from my hat and was holding in my hand. She graciously requested them of me through her page, and I willingly sent them to her. So this first act came to an end about 10 o'clock in the morning, and the trumpets were sounded again. However, at the time, we still could not see them. In the meantime, the bands had to go off with their prisoners and await the sentence. Now the 5 chiefs and ourselves were asked our advice, and the Virgin as president gave each one the opportunity to voice his opinion of what should be done with the prisoners. The first suggestion was that they should all be put to death, some more harshly than others, since they had shamelessly disobeyed the published rules. Others wanted them kept prisoner, but neither suggestion pleased the Virgin or myself. At last, the following proposal was made by the emperor whom I had released, a nobleman, my companion, and myself. That first, all the distinguished gentlemen should be led out of the castle without delay, then others driven out more ignominiously, yet others thrown out and left to run naked, and a 4th class beaten out with rods or hunted out by hounds. Those who had voluntarily resigned the day before should be let go without any penalty. And finally, the complete rogues and those that had behaved themselves so unseemly at dinner the previous day should be corporally or capitally punished in accordance with their misdeeds. This proposal pleased the Virgin very much and was passed. The people were even awarded, as a bonus, a midday meal, and were immediately told of this. But the sentence would also be given at 12 o'clock noon. Here the Senate came to an end, and the Virgin went to her usual quarters with her attendants. We were assigned the highest table in the hall, with a request that we would be content with that until the whole business was finished, after which we would be led to the noble bridegroom and bride, to all of which we willingly consented. Meanwhile, the prisoners were brought back into the hall, and each placed according to his station. They were ordered to behave themselves somewhat better than yesterday, advice which in truth was no longer necessary, since they had completely lost heart. I can honestly state, not that I wish to flatter, but simply as a truth, that in general the higher class personages knew better how to conduct themselves in such unexpected misfortune. The demeanour was poor enough, but honourable. Besides, they could not yet see their keepers. But I was very glad to discover that they were now visible to us. Although fortune had raised us so high, we still did not exalt ourselves over the others, but talked with them and urged them to be of good cheer. It would not turn out so ill. They would have liked to learn the sentences from us, but we were so strictly forbidden to tell them that we let nothing slip. Still, we comforted them as best we could, and drank with them in the hope that the wine might cheer them a little. Our table was spread with red velvet, and laid with pure silver and gold goblets, as the others noticed with great astonishment and great chagrin. But before we sat down, the 2 pages entered and presented us all, in the bridegroom's name, with the golden fleece with a flying lion. We were enjoined to wear this at table, and to guard well the honour and glory of the honour, which His Majesty thus awarded us, and would soon confirm with the proper solemnity. This we accepted with the greatest humility, and promised that we would obediently discharge whatever His Majesty should desire. The noble page also had a piece of paper on which we were assigned our places in order. However, I would rather not reveal my place, so as not to be accused of pride, which is against the fourth weight. Since we had been so magnificently treated, we asked one of the pages whether we were allowed to send some of our food down to our friends and acquaintances, and since no objection was raised, each one sent his friends a generous proportion by the servants, who still remained invisible to them. Since they did not know where this was coming from, I decided to take them something myself. Scarcely had I stood up than one of the servants was upon me, saying that he wished he had politely forewarned me. For if one of the pages had seen this, and it had come to the king's ear, it would certainly have turned out badly for me. But since no one had noticed, he was not going to give me away. I, however, should henceforth pay more heed to the honour of my order. The servant's words really terrified me, so that for a long time I scarcely dared stir in my chair, but I thanked him for his trusty warning, as well as I could in my fear and haste. Soon the trumpets sounded again. We were accustomed to this by now, knowing well that it was the Virgin, so we prepared ourselves to receive her. She entered on her high throne with her usual train, one page bearing before her a tall golden goblet, another a proclamation on parchment. When she had gracefully alighted from her seat, she took the cup from the page and handed it to us in the king's name, with the news that it was sent by His Majesty to be passed round all of us in his honour. On the lid of this cup stood Fortuna, beautifully crafted of gold, holding in her hand a flying red ensign. For this reason I drank from the cup rather less happily, being all too well acquainted with Fortune's tricks. Our Virgin was now decorated, as we were, with the golden fleece and the lion, from which I observed that she was perhaps the president of the order. We asked her what the order's name was, but she answered it was not time to reveal it until after the business with the prisoners was over. For this they were again blindfolded. What had happened to us before now seemed to them mild offence and vexation, and it was as naught in comparison to our present honour. Then she took the proclamation from the second page, divided into two parts. Something like the following was read out to the group. You should confess that you have lent credence too readily to false and spurious books, that you have thought too much of yourselves and entered this castle to which no one invited you. If perhaps the majority of you simply wanted to slip in here in order to live more grandly and pleasurably, you have egged one another on to such outrage and effrontery that you have well deserved to suffer condign punishment. They humbly acknowledged it and raised their hands. Then the other group were addressed more harshly in the following terms. You know very well, and stand convicted by your consciences, that you have forged false and spurious books, fooled and swindled others, thereby lowering the royal dignity in everyone's eyes. You also know what blasphemous and seductive pictures you have used, sparing not even the Holy Trinity, but using it for the cozening of one and all. Now it has come to light what tricks you have played on the rightful guests, and how you have introduced unsuspecting ones. Everyone knows that we've been involved in open whoring, adultery, debauchery, and every kind of uncleanness, all of it in defiance of the well-known law of our kingdom. In short, you know that you have demeaned His Majesty before the common people. Wherefore you should admit that you are publicly convicted swindlers, toadies and scoundrels who deserved to be sundered from decent folks and severely punished. The worthy artists were extremely reluctant to confess to all this. Not only did the Virgin threaten them, on her oath, with death, but the other group shouted loudly against them and complained with one voice that they had been deceitfully seduced by them. In the end, for fear of a still worse fate, they sorrowfully confessed their guilt. But they proposed in mitigation that they alone should not be blamed so harshly for what had happened. For when the noblemen were wanting to gain admission to the castle and were laying out great sums of money, each man had used his wits to get some, so that it had come to pass, as all could see. Since it had miscarried in their opinion, they deserved no more punishment than the nobles. The latter should surely have had the good judgment to see that one who was certain of getting in would not for mere gain, and in such danger, have clambered over the wall with them. Their books, moreover, had sold so well that anyone who could not live by other means was compelled to practice such a fraud. Therefore, they hoped that if justice was to be done, no harm would come to them, since they had behaved as servants should towards their lords, upon the latter's earnest entreaty. With such arguments they tried to excuse themselves, but they were answered thus: His Majesty has designed to punish one and all, some more severely, others less so. What you have proposed is indeed partly true, and on that account the nobles will not be entirely acquitted. Those, however, who have acted out of malice or corrupted the ignorant against their will should prepare to die. Likewise those who have uttered false libels against His Majesty, as all can see from their own writings and books. Thereupon arose a pitiful weeping and wailing, pleading and protestation, but it was to no avail. I was amazed at how the Virgin stood unmoved by the misery, whereas even we, to many of whom they had caused much suffering and anguish, were moved to pity and tears. Quickly she sent her page, who brought back with him all the men-at-arms who had attended the weighing earlier today. They were then ordered each to take his own band and lead them out in orderly procession to the great garden, every prisoner attended by a cuirassier. It astonished me to see how accurately each soldier recognised his own. But my companions of yesterday were permitted to go freely into the garden and witness the execution of the verdict. As soon as we were all outside, the Virgin leapt onto her throne and bade us sit down on the steps and attend the execution. We did as we were told, leaving everything on the table except the goblet, which the Virgin committed to the page's keeping, and wearing our decorations, mounted the throne. It slid forward by its own power, as gently as if it had been floating in the air, and thus we came to the garden, where we all dismounted. This garden was not particularly ornamental, but I was delighted by the way the trees were set out in rank and file. A fine fountain was also running there, decorated with wonderful pictures and inscriptions, also with strange symbols, which, God willing, I will explain in a future book. A wooden structure was erected in this garden, hung with beautiful painted cloths. It had 4 galleries, one above the other. The first was the most lordly, hence it was hung with a white satin curtain, so that we could not tell who was behind. The second was empty and undecorated. The last 2 were hung with red and blue satin. As we neared the scaffold, the Virgin bowed almost to the ground, filling us with fear, for we could easily tell that the King and Queen must not be far off. As soon as we too had made obeisance, the Virgin led us by the spiral stair to the second gallery. There she placed herself at the head, and us in the same order as before. For fear of malicious gossip, I cannot now tell how the Emperor whom I had rescued conducted himself towards me, as he had done earlier at table. For he could well see what distress and misery he would now have been in without me, awaiting his sentence in shame, and how, thanks to me, he now stood there in such dignity and honour. Meanwhile, the maiden who had originally brought me the invitation, and whom I had never seen again, stood forth, blew one blast on her trumpet, and with a loud voice pronounced the sentence. His Majesty informs all gentlemen present of a sincere wish that one and all assembled here had appeared at his invitation, with such qualities that they might honour him by attending the wedding banquet. But since it is otherwise pleased Almighty God, his Majesty will not complain, but most reluctantly abide by the ancient and laudable usage of this kingdom. However, that his Majesty's innate kindness may be celebrated throughout the world, he has decreed with his advisers and representatives that the usual sentence should be considerably mitigated. Therefore, in the first place, all noblemen and rulers shall not only have their lives spared, but shall straightway be set free to depart. He asks that your good lordships be not vexed that you cannot be present at his Majesty's wedding, but reflect that, if Almighty God has given you a burden that you cannot easily and patiently bear, he also has an unfathomable wisdom in the distribution of talents. Therefore, it shall be no disgrace to your lordship's reputation to be excluded from such an order as ours, for we cannot all attain all things. Since your lordships have been misled by evil toadies, these shall not go unpunished. Next, his Majesty wishes to share with you a catalogue of heretical writings, or an index of things to be purged, whereby you may more wisely sift the good from the bad. And since his Majesty intends, before long, to overhaul his own library and sacrifice the offending books to Vulcan, he requests your friendship, service and grace, that each may do likewise with his own, so that hopefully in the future all this evil and rubbish shall be destroyed. Moreover, may you be warned hereby never again to demand admittance here, lest your excuse about seducers be withdrawn and you suffer the contempt and mockery of all. Lastly, since the province has something to demand from your lordships, let none demur to ransom himself with a chain, or whatever he has to hand, and thus depart from us in friendship, and under our escort make his way back to his own. The others, however, who did not resist the first, third, and fourth weights, are not so lightly dismissed by his Majesty. That they may also feel his mercy, his command is that they be stripped entirely naked, and thus sent away. Those who were proved too light by the second and fifth weight shall be stripped, and then branded with 1, 2, or more marks, according to one's offence. Those that were raised up only by the sixth and seventh weight shall be treated somewhat more mercifully, and so forth, a specific punishment being set for each combination, which would take too long to enumerate here. Those who voluntarily resigned yesterday shall be allowed to go free from all obligation. Lastly, the arrant swindlers who could not even outweigh a single weight shall suffer capital or corporal punishment according to their deserts, with the sword, the rope, with water, or with rods, and this sentence shall be executed strictly as an example to all. Thereupon our virgin broke her staff in two. The other maiden, who had read the sentence, sounded her trumpet, and with a deep obeisance went to those standing behind the curtain. I cannot forbear here from telling the reader something of the number of prisoners. Those who equalled 1 weight were 7, 2 weights 21, 3 weights 35, 4 weights also 35, 5 weights 21, 6 weights 7. One was raised only with difficulty by all 7 weights, and this was the one I had redeemed. Those who failed to raise any weight at all were many, and lastly, those who raised them all from the ground were few. So I counted them carefully and noted them on my writing tablet as they stood distinctly before us. It seemed remarkable to me that among all those who weighed anything, no 2 were exactly the same. For although, as I said, 35 of them equalled 3 weights, in one case it would be the 1st, 2nd and 3rd, in another the 3rd, 4th and 5th, in another the 5th, 6th, 7th and so forth. Thus, amazing enough, among the 126 who weighed anything, no 2 were the same. If time would permit, I would name them all with their respective weights, but I hope it may be published in the future with the interpretation. Now, as the sentence was read out, the nobles were at first quite happy, since in the face of such severity they had not reckoned on getting a light sentence. Thus they gave more than was demanded, each paying with whatever chains, metalwork, gold, money, etc. he had about him, and politely taking his leave. Although the royal servants were forbidden to jeer at them as they went, a few jokers could not help from giggling, for it was comical enough to see how fast they made their escape, without a backward glance. A few asked that the promised catalogue might be sent them at once, for they wanted to deal with their books as it would please His Majesty. This was also promised them. Beneath the porch, each was given a beaker of the draught of forgetfulness, so that he might forget his misfortune. After these, the volunteers departed. They were allowed to go because of their good sense, but never again might they return in the same condition. However, if they, like the others, should receive further revelations, they would be welcome guests. Meanwhile, the culprits were being stripped, and here too appropriate distinctions were made. Some were driven away naked but unmolested. Some were decked out with bells and jingles, some pursued with whips. In short, the penalties were so various that I cannot enumerate them all. Finally it came to the last ones, whose treatment took a little longer, for it took a considerable time for some to be hanged, some beheaded or drowned, and others to be put to death in different ways. My eyes truly ran over at this execution, not so much because of the punishments which they had well deserved for their crimes, but in reflecting on human delusion, in that we are always meddling in that which has been sealed up for us since the fall of man. Now the garden, formerly so crowded with people, was almost empty, and none but the men at arms remained. When all was over, there was silence for 5 minutes. Then there came a beautiful, snow-white unicorn with a golden collar on which were certain letters. It stepped up to the fountain and knelt down on its 4 legs, as if it wished to honour the lion which stood upon the fountain, so still that I had taken it for stone or bronze. Immediately the lion took the naked sword that it held in its claws and broke it in 2 in the middle, whereupon the pieces appeared to me to sink in the water. Then it roared long, till a white dove flew up, bringing in its little beak a sprig of olive, which the lion straightway swallowed and was satisfied. The unicorn also returned contentedly to its place. Hereupon our Virgin again descended the spiral stair from the wooden structure. Hereupon our Virgin again descended the spiral stair from the wooden structure, and we made our obeisance towards the curtain. Then we had to wash our hands and heads in the fountain, and await a little while in our order till the king had returned to his hall through a concealed passageway. We were conducted out of the garden and back to our former quarters with special music in great pomp and splendour and with elevated conversation. This was towards 4 o'clock in the afternoon. In order to make the time pass more quickly, the Virgin had appointed each of us a well-bred page, not only richly dressed, but also well-educated. These pages could discourse on any subject so knowingly that we were quite put to shame. They had the duty of showing us around the castle, though not everywhere, so as to pass the time and satisfy our curiosity. Meanwhile, the Virgin took her leave, promising us that she would reappear at supper, and then celebrate the ceremony of the hanging of the weights. She bade us await the next day with patience, for then we must be presented to the king. When she had taken leave of us, each one did as he pleased. Some looked at the beautiful pictures that were shown to them, and were curious to know what the mysterious symbols might mean. Others needed to refresh themselves again with food and drink. But I let myself be guided round the palace by my page, together with my companion, and we will never regret that tour as long as I live. For among the many wonderful antiquities, I was also shown the tombs of the kings, where I learned more than is to be found in all the books in the world. There too stands the miraculous phoenix, about which I published a special booklet 2 years ago. I also intend, if my narrative should prove fruitful, to publish separate treatises on lions, eagles, griffins, falcons, and other things, with their illustrations and inscriptions. I'm only sorry that my other companions missed such treasures, yet I suppose this must have been God's expressed desire. I was especially glad of my page, for according to each person's interest, his page led him into places and situations that he would enjoy. Mine alone was entrusted with the keys to this place, because his pleasure was reserved especially for me. Others indeed were invited, but they thought that such tombs would only be found in the churchyard, to which they would come soon enough if there were anything worth seeing there. But I could not withhold from my grateful students the tombs that the two of us drew and transcribed. The other thing shown to us both was a marvellous library. Everything was there, complete, as before the Reformation. But even though my heart leaps whenever I think of it, I will not yet tell about it, because its catalogue is shortly to be published. By the entrance to this room stood an enormous book, such as I had never seen, in which were pictured all the figures, chambers, portals, all the inscriptions, riddles, and such like, to be seen in the whole castle. Although I have also promised to give some of these, it seems not yet the proper time. I must first learn to know the world better. In every book, the author's portrait was painted. Many of these, as I understand, were to be burnt, so that their memory would be blotted out among righteous men. When we had perused these things, and had just left, another page ran up to us and whispered something into her page's ear. The latter gave up the keys to him, which the other immediately took up the spiral staircase. Our page had turned as white as death, and when we beset him with questions, informed us that His Majesty wanted no one to visit either the library or the tombs. Hence he begged us, for his life's sake, not to give him away to anyone, since he had just denied it. Thus we also promised him, half in joy and half in fear, and fortunately it remained secret, for no one asked us any more about it. We had spent 3 hours in the two places, which I will never regret. Although it had already struck 7, we had still been given nothing to eat. But our hunger was easily satisfied by the continual stimulation, and I could have fasted my life long on nourishment like this. We were also shown ingenious waterworks, mines, and various ateliers, none of which failed to surpass all of our arts and crafts taken together. The rooms were all arranged in a semicircle, so that they had a view of the splendid mechanical clock, mounted on a beautiful tower in the centre, and could regulate themselves according to the movements of the planets, which were charmingly depicted on it. There again, it was clear to me how far short our own artists fall, though it's not my business to instruct them. At length we came to a large hall, which the others had been shown long before. In the middle stood a terrestrial globe, 30 feet in diameter, although nearly half of it, except a little that was covered by the steps, was sunk in the ground. 2 men could easily turn this globe and its apparatus, so that the same amount was always visible above the horizon. Although I could well see that this instrument had a particular purpose, I could not understand what was served by the small golden circles visible at various places on it. My page laughed at this and told me to examine them more closely. I found thereon my own country, also marked with gold, whereon my companion searched for his own and found it likewise. Since this was also the case with the other bystanders, the page assured us that yesterday the old astronomer Atlas had shown His Majesty that the gilded points indicated with perfect accuracy the homes of all the elect. For this reason the page, too, when he saw that I had excluded myself, though there was a mark on my country, had instructed one of the captains to plead for us, that we might take our chances on the scales without risk, especially since the country of one of us had a remarkably favourable sign. Hence also he, who of all the pages had the most influence, had not been assigned to me without reason. I thanked him for this, and looked more carefully at my native land, noticing that near the circle were some delicate rays, though I did not mention this for my own name and fame. I saw much more on this globe that I prefer not to reveal. Everyone may ask himself why every town does not have its philosopher. After this, he led us right into the globe, which was made so that on the sea, where there was otherwise a great empty space, there was placed a tablet with 3 dedications and the artist's name. One could raise this gently and gain access via a slender bridge to the centre, where there was a room for 4 people. Nothing else was inside but a round bench on which we sat, and even in full daylight, it was now dark, could contemplate the stars. I think these were made from pure carbuncle, glittering so beautifully in their proper order and course that I could scarcely bear to leave, as the page later told our Virgin, for which she often teased me. For it was already mealtime, and I had stared so long inside the globe that I was almost the last at table. I could tarry no longer, and as soon as I had put on my coat, which I had laid aside, I came to the table. The servants greeted me with such bowing and scraping that I dared not look up for shame, and thus accidentally left the Virgin standing as she awaited me to one side. As soon as she noticed, she pulled me by the gown and led me to table. I need tell no more about the music and other delights, partly because I am quite unworthy to describe them, and partly because I have already done so as best I can. In a word, there was nothing but artistry and beauty. After we had told each other of our various experiences of the afternoon, though the library and tomb were not mentioned, and were feeling merry from the wine, the Virgin began to speak. Gentlemen, I am having a great argument with one of my sisters. In our room, we have an eagle whom we are both feeding with meat in order to win his affection, and this has caused much ill will. One day, we decided to go to him together and let him belong to whichever of us he was most friendly to. We did so, with myself, as usual, carrying a branch of laurel in my hand. When the eagle saw us both, he quickly gave my sister a twig that he had in his beak, and then begged for mine, which I gave him. Now, each one believes that he likes her the best. What should I do about this? We all enjoyed the Virgin's modest proposal, and everyone would gladly have heard the solution. But since all their eyes rested on me, and they wanted me to begin, I was so muddled in my head that I could do nothing but ask another riddle. So I said, "Gracious lady, it would be easy to answer your question if it were not for a trouble of my own. I had 2 friends, both extraordinarily attached to me. Since they could not decide which of them loved me the most, they made up their minds to run up to me unawares. Whoever I embraced first, he would be the one. This they did, but since one could not keep up with the other, he was left behind and wept. I received the other with surprise. When they explained the trick, I knew no way out, and so I've been stuck to this day in the hope of finding good counsel here." The Virgin thought this over, well seeing what I was about, and therefore answered, "Very good, then let us 2 be quits. Let the others propose a solution." But I had already made them wise, and so a second one began. "In my town, a maiden was lately condemned to death, but the judge was so sorry that he let it be known that if anyone would fight for her, she would be his. Now she had 2 lovers. One immediately came to the lists to await his adversary. Then the other presented himself, but since he came too late, he decided all the same to fight for her, and willingly let himself be beaten, so that her life would be spared. And this he did. Afterwards both of them wanted her. Now tell me, gentlemen, which of the 2 had won her?" Then the Virgin could hold back no longer and said, I hope to learn much, but now I am ensnared myself. Still, I would like to hear if anyone else has something to say." "Indeed," answered a third, "never has a stranger story been told than what once happened to me. In my youth, I was in love with a virtuous girl. In order to bring my love to its desired goal, I employed an old woman who would take me with her to visit the girl. Now it happened that the girl's brothers came upon us while the 3 of us were alone together. They were so angry that they wanted to kill me, but I implored them so much that they finally made me swear to take each one to wife for a year. Now tell me, gentlemen, should I have taken the older or the younger one first?" We all laughed heartily at this riddle, and although some whispered together, none wanted to make the choice. Then a 4th began. "There lived in a town an honourable aristocratic lady whom many admired, but especially a young nobleman. He became so importunate that she finally gave him this ultimatum. He could have his way if, in the middle of winter, he could lead her into a beautiful green rose garden. If not, then he could never see her again. Thereupon, the nobleman travelled in every land to find a man who could bring this about, until at last he came upon an old fellow who promised to do it on condition that he would give him half of his possessions. He agreed, and the other arranged it. He invited the woman to his garden, and to her astonishment, she found everything green, pleasant, and warm. When she remembered her vow, she asked to go once more to her husband, to whom she poured out her sorrow with sighs and tears. He, however, knowing well her faithfulness, sent her back to her lover, who had bought her so dear, to redeem her promise. The nobleman was so moved by the husband's integrity that he felt it would be sinful to touch so virtuous a wife, and sent her back honourably to her husband. Now, when the little old man learnt of their fidelity, poor as he was, he did not want to be left out. So he gave the nobleman back all his property and departed. Now, gentlemen, I do not know which of these people displayed the greatest virtue. This tale left us all speechless. Even the virgin had no answer but to ask another one of us to go on. So the fifth began without delay. Gentlemen, I will make it short. Who has a greater joy, the one who beholds his beloved, or the one who only has her in his thoughts? The one who sees her, said the virgin. No, I replied, whereupon an argument began. Then the sixth cried out, Gentlemen, I would take a wife, but I have the choice of a maiden, a married woman, and a widow. Help me out of my dilemma, and I will settle yours. Nothing easier, replied the seventh, if the choice is free. But for me, things are different. In my youth, I loved a beautiful, virtuous girl from the bottom of my heart, and she loved me. But our kinsman would not give permission for us to marry. So she was married to another man, honest and upright, who kept her with modesty and affection till she came to childbed, and was so ill that everyone thought she had died. With great sorrow, they gave her a magnificent burial. Then I thought to myself, if this person could not be yours in life, at least you can embrace her in death and kiss her to your heart's content. So I took my servant with me and dug her up again by night. When I opened the coffin and took her in my arms, I felt her heart and discovered that it was still beating a little. As I warmed her, it became stronger and stronger until I could see that she was indeed still alive. Then I silently took her home with me, after warming her frozen body with a bath of precious herbs, committed her to the care of my mother until she gave birth to a fine son, whom I cared for as lovingly as I had the mother. After 2 days, since she was greatly confused, I revealed to her all that had occurred, and asked her to live as my wife from now on. But she was greatly worried that it might give grief to her husband, who had treated her well and honourably. However, as such things will turn out, she now felt no less obligated to one as to the other. After 2 months, being then obliged to travel elsewhere, I invited her husband as a guest, and asked him, among other things, whether he would take back his dead wife if she were to come home again. He affirmed it with tears and lamentations. Finally I brought his wife to him, together with her son, and told him all that had happened, and asked him to give consent for my intended marriage. After a long argument, he could not shake my claim, and so had to leave his wife with me. Then came the battle over the son. The virgin here interrupted him and said, "I'm surprised that you could thus increase the poor man's misery." "What?" he answered. "Was I not concerned about it?" Thereupon an argument arose among us, in which most of us were of the opinion that he had done right. But he said, "Not at all. I gave him back both wife and son. Now tell me, gentlemen, which was the greater, my integrity or this man's happiness?" These words had so aroused the virgin that she straightway had a toast sent round in honour of these two. Then followed the stories of the others, but since they were somewhat confused, I cannot recall them all. Only one still occurs to me. He said that, a few years ago, he knew a physician who had bought wood against the winter, and the whole winter long had kept himself warm with it. But when spring approached, he sold the same wood again, and thus warmed himself for nothing. "That must be an art," said the virgin, "but it is too late for it today." "Yes," answered my companions, Whoever cannot solve all the riddles may ask for the answers by messenger. This, I think, cannot be refused." Now grace was said, and we all stood up from the table, more satisfied and merry than glutted. I could wish that all feasts and meals were conducted thus. As we were taking a turn or two in the hall, the Virgin asked us whether we would like to make a start with the wedding. "Gladly," said one, "O noble and virtuous maiden." Thereupon she discreetly sent a page off, but continued in conversation with us. She was so familiar with us that I was bold enough to ask her name. Then the Virgin smiled at my impertinence, but did not get annoyed, and answered, "My name contains 55, but it has 8 letters. The third part is a third part of the 5th. If it is added to the 6th, they make the number whose root exceeds the first letter by as much as the third itself, and is half the 4th. The 5th and 7th are equal, and the last is equal to the first, and these make as much with the 2nd as the 6th, which is just 4 more than thrice the 3rd. Now tell me, sir, what is my name?" The riddle seemed thorny enough. However, I did not give up, but asked, "Noble and virtuous maiden, might I not know a single letter?" "Yes," she said, "that would be all right." "Then how much," I went on, "would the 7th be worth?" "It is as many as the gentleman here." Then I was satisfied, and easily worked out her name. This pleased her, and she said that more would be revealed to us soon. In the meantime, a number of maidens had made themselves ready, and now entered with great show. Before them 2 youths lighted the way. One had a cheerful face, bright eyes, and a fine figure, but the other looked somewhat petulant. Whatever he wanted must be done, as I afterwards learnt. Next followed 4 maidens, one of them very demure in her conduct, looking modestly at the ground. The second equally modest and bashful. The third was frightened of something as she entered the room. As I understood it, she cannot long remain where people are too hearty. The fourth carried some bouquets to indicate her friendliness and generosity. After these 4 maidens came 2 others, more elaborately dressed, and greeted us courteously. One wore a deep blue dress, set with little golden stars. The other was all in green, ornamented with red and white stripes. Both had loose kerchiefs on their heads, which looked utterly charming. Lastly came one on her own, who wore a coronet on her head, and looked up to heaven rather than to earth. We all thought she must be the bride, but were far wrong, although she so outdid the bride in nobility, wealth, and status that she afterwards dominated the whole wedding feast. At this point, we all followed the example of our Virgin, sinking deep on our knees, although the lady behaved very humbly and reverently. She offered each her hand, and bade us not to be too surprised at this, for it was the least of her gifts. But we should lift our eyes to our Creator, and learn to recognize His omnipotence here, then lead our lives as before, using this grace for the glory of God and the good of mankind. Her words were very different from those of our Virgin, who was somewhat more worldly. They pierced through my very marrow. "And you," she went on, addressing me, "have received more than others. See that you also give more." This sermon puzzled me greatly. When we noticed the maidens with instruments, we thought we were all going to have to dance, but the time had not yet come. The waits, about which I have told, were still all there. Hence the Queen, though I still did not know who she was, told each maiden to take one of them. She gave her own, the last and biggest, to our Virgin, and bade us follow her. Now our prestige was somewhat lessened, and I was well aware that our Virgin had been overkind to us, and that we were not valued as highly as we had sometimes begun to imagine. So we went out in our usual order until we reached the first room, where our Virgin was the first to hang up the Queen's weight. Then a beautiful anthem was sung. In this room was nothing valuable but some fine little prayer books, such as one should never be without. In the middle stood a tall lectern, excellently suited for prayer. The Queen knelt down at this, and we all had to kneel around her and pray after her as she read from one of the books, namely, that the wedding might go forward to God's glory and to our benefit. Then we moved to the second room, where the first maiden hung up her weight, and so forth until the ceremony was completed. Thereupon, the Queen again gave each her hand and took her leave with her maidens. Our President stayed with us a while, but since it was already 2:00 in the morning, she did not want to keep us longer. It was my impression that she enjoyed being with us. She wished us a good night and a peaceful sleep, but it seemed as if she parted from us unwillingly. Our pages knew their business well. They showed us each to his bedroom and remained with us in another bed, so as to be at hand if we should need anything. My bedroom, I know nothing of the others, was royally furnished and hung with beautiful tapestries and paintings. Most of all, I liked my page. He was so well informed and accomplished that he kept me up for yet another hour, and I did not fall asleep until 3:30. That was the first night I went to sleep in peace. Nevertheless, a dreadful dream kept me from being too contented. All night long I was struggling with a door I could not open. Finally I succeeded, and in such fantasies passed the time until towards dawn I awoke.